and that the doors of opportunity remain open to all. When Barack came to my office to pay his respects on that cold winter day 10 years earlier, I told him I'd be happy to have him on the committee and I would make sure it happened. We didn't have much time to talk, and I suggested we meet again, get to know each other a little better. I knew his family was still back in Chicago and he was commuting, as I was, so I told him if he ever wanted to grab dinner together some night I'd be happy to do that. I could stay down after Senate business was done and we could go to a local Italian restaurant just off the hill. Nothing fancy, I said. Oh, we can go to a nice place, he said, explaining that his book royalties had set him up just fine. I can afford it. I can afford it, rang in my ears as a strange comment, bordering on arrogant. It only occurred to me later, as I got to know him well, that Barack was not the sort to talk about what he could afford, and that he might have been offended that I had taken him for a man of limited resources. Just as it probably did not occur to Barack at the time that I am a man of limited resources. We never did have that dinner, but he and I had an awful lot of lunches in the years after that. Barack Obama first called me about being considered as his running mate in June 2008, not long after he had secured enough delegates for the nomination. I was riding home to Wilmington on the train when my phone rang. He asked my permission to vet me, and I said no. I'll help you any way I can, I told him. But I don't want to be vice president. I obviously didn't say this lightly. I was honored to be asked, but I had been a United States Senator for 35 years. A job I loved, in an institution I reviewed. I had gained respect as a formidable legislator and had seniority. I was my own man, and I enjoyed what I was doing. I also believed I could make more significant contributions as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee than I could as vice president. He insisted that this was not just an exercise and gave me the impression that I was already his leading candidate. This is real, he said. But I needn't answer now. Then the answer is no. Do me a favor, Joe. Go home and talk it over with the family first. I agreed to do that, and when I hung up I called Jill and asked her to call a family meeting. The 5 of us sat down that evening to talk. My family's response surprised me. They were all for it. Bo and Hunt argued that I could help Obama win key states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida, and my foreign policy experience would help the ticket. Jill was actually relieved by Barack's call. She had been afraid, based on all the well-placed Democrats suggesting it to her, that Obama was going to recruit me to be his Secretary of State and I'd live the next 4 years on airplanes and in foreign capitals. Being vice president would be a new challenge for the entire family, she said. There was also something appealing to Jill about having the vice president's official residence as a base in Washington, which would mean we would have one home just a few minutes away from Hunt and his 3 daughters, and another a few minutes from Bo and his 2 children. It would eliminate the 4-hour commute I had been making every day the Senate was in session for the last 35 years, and it would give me more access to my grandchildren. The other compelling argument was this: even if my participation was just a footnote, I would have had a part in helping to elect the first African American president of the United States and a man I believed could be a great president. My 90-year-old mother, who had watched my lifelong fight for civil rights and racial equality, put it this way at a larger family meeting the next day: so, let me get this straight, honey. The first African American in history who has a chance to be president says he needs your help to win and you said no. The decision, even with the family's encouragement, was still difficult. I had been in Washington long enough to watch 8 different vice presidents, and I knew the history. The office itself has a long and storied career as a punchline. Benjamin Franklin suggested the vice president be referred to as his superfluous excellency. Richard Nixon was the victim of what might be the only joke Dwight Eisenhower made in his 8 years as president. Eisenhower was asked during Nixon's hard-fought campaign against John F. Kennedy if he could delineate for reporters some of the major decisions his vice president had helped to shape. "If you give me a week," Eisenhower replied, "I might think of one." When Calvin Coolidge took the job, his predecessor forward to it, he said. So am I. Half an hour after I accepted, Jill and I walked through our front door and found Ashley sitting in the kitchen. She must have seen something in our faces. Daddy, she said, he called, didn't he? Yes, he did. And you said yes. I told you I would, honey, I said. Yes. I accepted. She jumped up and threw her arms around me. Daddy, you know how. You're always quoting Seamus Heaney's poem, she said. I think everybody in the family could recite The Cure at Troy by heart at that point. They'd heard me quoted so many times over the years. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up. And hope and history rhyme. Dad, this is hope and history. Oh, great, I joked. He's hope. And I'm history. But I knew what she meant, and I was happy that she was so happy. We got on the phone and told the entire family. And I didn't doubt for one moment that we had made the right decision. When I was being considered for vice president and reached out to Walter Mondale for advice, he told me his weekly lunch with President Jimmy Carter turned out to be the cornerstone of their working relationship. So Barack and I decided to follow that advice as a way to make sure we had regular meetings where we could talk to each other privately, and with absolute honesty, about anything that was on our minds. We started having our weekly lunch meeting the first month we got to the White House. Even 6 years in, I still looked forward to them. Not that we didn't spend plenty of time together already. From the outset he included me in all his key meetings. We must have spent 1,000 hours together in the Situation Room by then. We started every day in the Oval Office for the daily intelligence briefing. I was at the weekly Principals Committee meeting of his National Security Team, meetings with foreign policy and economic advisors, his bilateral meetings with visiting heads of state, and meetings with congressional leaders. It didn't take long for me to figure out that it was not just pro forma. The president wanted my read on everything that was happening, and he wanted me around. Almost everybody who comes into contact with the president is hungry for something, sometimes nothing more than an acknowledgement, or simply to be put at ease, but most of all to be heard. There was no escaping that for Barack, and it could be draining. Why do they need so much attention? He complained to me one day after a congressional delegation left the office. They constantly have to be reinforced. We talked about our wives. We talked about the close friendship between his daughters and my grandchildren, and what was going on in their lives. We talked about golf. You know what has surprised me, the president said to me at one of our earlier lunches. How we have become such good friends. Surprised you? I joked. As I walked into the Oval Office for our weekly lunch on January 5th, 2015. Almost 6.5 years after I accepted the vice presidency, President Obama was, as usual, at his desk. "Nah. You hungry?" he said, and led me back past the little study off the main office and into his private dining room. The setting was formal. The president kept only a few personal possessions in the room. Some pictures of his daughters in a pair of red boxing gloves, in a glass case. Signed by Muhammad Ali. We shed our suit coats and walked to opposite ends of a 6-foot-long mahogany table. He complimented me on a job well done, Ed. The police memorial in New York. "What do you have for today?" the president said, as we sat. Barack was just back from his Christmas vacation in Hawaii and he seemed to have an extra degree of calm in his already placid demeanor. The last midterm election of his political career was behind him, and though it hadn't gone well for us Democrats, the president would never again have to stand and be judged by voters. He still had 2 years in office, and he was determined to make them count. There were big things out there for us to accomplish, and he had a list of priorities to talk over at lunch that day. The president was one of the few people I had told about Bo's battle with cancer. I felt I had to tell him, because there were times when I had to clandestinely fly to Houston or to Philadelphia for procedures or consultations, and Bo wanted to keep everything private. He did not want this to be a press story, and Barack fully understood. I knew I could count on the president to keep it under wraps. But I also knew that the president his trust in others. He travels light, one staffer said of him. Obama's improbable rise in politics. He was a little-known state legislator from the South side of Chicago in 2003 and President of the United States 5 years later was based in part on the fact that he did travel light. Barack Obama did not appear to belong to anyone except Michelle and his daughters, not campaign donors, or labor leaders, or civil rights groups, or even friends. I think voters intuited that he would not permit political debts, racial identity, personal attachment, or emotion to cloud his judgment on any big decision. They really believed he would call it as he saw it. The president had the further benefit of near absolute self-sufficiency. Unlike most people I know, his own sense of his worth seemed entirely independent of what other people thought of him. He was almost never ruffled by the slights and unfair criticisms I saw him endure. There were times when I got so irritated at the way people disrespected him, the president, right in the Oval Office, that I was ready to lay into them. Barack knew when I was angry on his behalf, and he would occasionally tell me to back off. "Hey, Joe," he would say, "you've got to take the good with the bad." I knew he could defend himself just fine when he was moved to do so, and I usually let it pass, but there were times when I couldn't help myself. "Don't talk about the president that way," I growled at one former Democratic Senate colleague, who said that while she agreed with the president, she didn't like him. "Don't talk about my friend that way," I said. "We're going to have a problem." Not that I didn't get frustrated with the president on occasion. He never gave me a reason to doubt his strategic judgment in 8 years of close-up observation, and there was rarely any daylight between us in matters of policy. But sometimes I thought he was deliberate to a fault. "Just trust your instincts, Mr. President," I would say to him, on major decisions that had to be made fast. I had learned over the years, a president was never going to have more than about 70% of the information needed. So once you have checked the experts, statistics, data, and intelligence, you have to be willing to rely on your gut. There were times when we were unhappy with each other, but when he was upset with me, I heard about it in private, not on the nightly news. At the end of the day, I was appreciative that he was straight with me. And the few times I was really upset with him, I was straightforward and direct about my anger. I made no bones about it. But that's how friends treat one another. They level. I think those occasions actually deepened our relationship. I felt like he treated me as much as an equal as a president is able to. He never gave me an order. "I don't keep Joe's schedule," he would tell staff, "and Joe doesn't keep mine." Most important to me, he honored the one request I had made of him before I accepted his offer to be vice president. Obama reportedly joked with his campaign team that he had said to me, "I want your advice, Joe. I just want it in 10-minute, not 60-minute increments." But he kept his end of the bargain all the way through to the end. He invited me in to be the last person in the room to offer counsel before any big decision was made. I offered what advice and wisdom I could, but I also tried to offer simple encouragement. The cares of the presidency sit heavy on any person in that office, and there were times when Barack got down. He would become quieter, more reflective, and more withdrawn. He had a distant look. When I saw him start to retreat like that, I always made a point to stick around after our next meeting in the Oval Office. I would wait until everybody else filed out and close the door behind them. "Remember, Mr. President," I would say when it was just the two of us, "the country can never be more hopeful than its president. Don't make me hope. You gotta go out there and be hope." We spent so much time together that we developed unspoken cues and inside humor to ease the pressures of office. Sometimes he would muse out loud, "Why would Senator X do this? And why would Congressman Y do that?" It was so gratuitous, or so unnecessary, or so impolite. "Why?" And I would tell him about my Uncle Ed Finnegan, who had an answer for this kind of thing that was not exactly specific but always satisfying. "Yeah, no, Joey," Uncle Ed would say. "There's no accounting for horses' asses." And Uncle Ed's line became a key bit.
I. Out a second. Machine the Clintons had spent the past 40 years engineering. The president had been Solomon-like when pressed by reporters to choose between Hillary and me. Both Hillary and Joe would make outstanding presidents and possess the qualities that are needed to be outstanding presidents, he had said. And they've got different strengths, but both of them would be outstanding. But I knew a number of the president's former staffers, and even a few current ones, were putting a finger on the scale for Clinton. In January 2015 the president was convinced I could not beat Hillary, and he worried that a long primary fight would split the party and leave the Democratic nominee vulnerable in the general election. More than anything, he did not want to see a Republican in the White House in 2017. I got it, and never took issue with him. This was about Barack's legacy, and a significant portion of that legacy had not yet been cast in stone. I didn't think it possible for a new Republican administration to roll back Barack's landmark health care program, or the Violence Against Women Act, or the gains made by the LGBT community. But we both knew that if a Republican won the presidency, he or she could really unravel Barack's legacy on foreign policy. Neither of us wanted that. I think the president was also concerned that if I ran and lost, it would diminish my own legacy. And finally, I think he wondered about my ability to do my job as vice president and run for the nomination while dealing with Bo's battle with brain cancer. When Barack brought it up at lunch that day, he did it with a soft touch. If I could appoint anyone to be president for the next 8 years, it would be you, Joe, he told me. We have the same values, same vision, same goals. You earned the right to make a decision based on how you feel about the race. I told him that after watching him do it for the last 6 years, I had no desire to live in the White House. It's the most confining thing in the world, the president said, but he didn't stop to dwell on it. He was almost in a reverie about his own future. He told me his Christmas vacation had allowed him for the first time to picture what the next 25 years could be like. I think I can do more than I was able to do as president, he said. He said he understood how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Joe, have you focused on that? How do you want to spend the rest of your life? How do you want to spend the rest of your life? It was a hard question for me to answer that day. I wish I could have said, sure, I can ride off into the sunset, too, and be satisfied in content. But it wasn't that simple for me. Part of it was the mere fact that Bo was hanging tough, determined to do whatever he had to do to make it, gave the entire family hope. From the very beginning, way back in the late summer of 2013, Bo had opted for the most aggressive course his oncologist could chart. When Dr. Young recommended that Bo endure triple the amount of the standard chemo drug, called Temodar, while also taking part in the first field trial of an experimental drug treatment designed to boost the effect of Temodar, Bo said, let's do it. A few months later, when Dr. Young suggested adding an unapproved but promising new drug to combat one of the mutations that made his tumor especially virulent. Bo said, "Let's do it." Dr. Young cautioned that while there was evidence in animal studies that the drug worked, there were no human studies to back it up. There could also be uncomfortable side effects. "If there's a skin rash," Bo said, "I'll just wear long sleeves and a baseball cap. All good." In April 2014, when Bo began having difficulties with his speech about 8 months into his treatment, the doctors could not be sure from the scans whether the difficulties were caused by new tumor growth or the delayed effects of his earlier 6-week run of radiation. After receiving special permission from the pharmaceutical company, Dr. Young asked Bo if he could start him on a well-tested drug that might diminish swelling and seal up leaky blood vessels around the tumor bed. Bo said, "Let's do it." The new drug was given intravenously, and the big needle could be incredibly painful, but Bo never complained. Jill knew, though, and she went with him to the weekly procedure in Philadelphia and made sure he got the nurse who was the gentlest and most expert at inserting the foal. A few months later, in the summer of 2014, Bo went out and bought an expensive new powerboat so he could take Natalie and Hunter out for long rides and fishing on the Susquehanna River or Chesapeake Bay. Bo loved to be on the water, the spray on his face, Child Predator Task Force that Bo created and oversaw had arrested and convicted more than 200 child abusers and rescued 129 children from abusive situations by then. "My focus from the beginning has been to protect the most vulnerable among us," he said, "and no one is more vulnerable than our children." And Bo also kept going home at night to be with Hallie, Natalie, and Hunter. "I read to my children every night," he said to the Advanced Practice nurse in Houston, People Luli, the first time they ever met. "I need time to read to my children." He insisted on climbing to the top of a beautiful mountain trail on our family trip to the Teddens, even though his weak leg made it a real struggle. Bo refused to burden anybody outside of his brother, Hunter, with his actual dread, not even his mother or me. So tomorrow was his 46th birthday, February 3, 2015, but he did not want to make a big to-do. And besides, Bo reminded Jill, this was Hunter's year. Hunt's birthday is the day after Bo's, and the two of them had always
Alternated years on who got to pick the birthday meal. Chicken pot pie, right? Mom. Hunter would say. Homemade. I had a full schedule that week, as I had almost every week since Bo's diagnosis. I had planned it that way. When I got back to Washington after we learned Bo had brain cancer, I called my chief of staff, Steve Ricchetti, into my office to talk. Steve knew the whole family had been down to MD Anderson with Bo, and he knew that we had returned with bad news. But he didn't know how bad it was. I'm just going to tell you this is very serious and it's going to be a very difficult time, I said to Steve as we both settled into our chairs in my West Wing office. The only way I'm going to get through this is if you just keep me busy. Schedule me. Try to keep everything that we would normally be doing. Keep it in front of me, and keep me working. Steve is an easygoing guy who had proven willing to do almost anything I asked, but I could tell by the way he was looking at me that this request went against his natural humane instincts. Look, Steve, this is going to be hard on you, too, but I'm pleading with you to do this for me, I explained. I know what's best because, unfortunately, I've lived through this before. The only way I survived, the only way I got through it, was by staying busy and keeping my mind, when it can be, focused on my job. Steve said he would do whatever I asked of him, and he was as good as his word. There were a few times in the next 18 months when Jill pulled Steve aside to talk. Joe's working too hard, she would say. He's exhausted. He's not sleeping. It's going to kill him. It put Steve in a tough spot. He agreed with Jill. There were times when he thought my schedule bordered on cruel, but he was under strict orders from the boss. Steve had also come to believe that part of my insistence on keeping up with the demands of my job was a desire to prove to Bo and Hunt and Ashley that I was fine. That I was still capable of handling anything and everything that was asked of me. I would be happy to do anything he'd let me do, Steve would say to Jill. Diplomatically. And then the two of them would conspire to get me to ease off. For a while. I would hear them out when they made the case to me and say no to a few events or meetings before going right back to the 15 or 16-hour workdays. Then Jill would call Steve again and say, this has to stop, and Steve would say he agreed. And sometimes when we were at home alone, Jill would say the same to me, you've got to stop, Joe. You're going to get run down and you're going to get sick. I'm really worried about you, only I wasn't so quick to agree. Steve and Jill worried more than they needed to, was the way I saw it. When I looked at my schedule for the first week in February 2015, I noticed there was a lot to do, some of it truly significant but all of it was doable. My daily schedule card for that Monday even looked a little thin, a series of meetings in the White House and lunch with the president. But I was headed overseas in 3 days, and there was a lot of unfinished business I wanted to push forward before I left town. So Monday was my best chance to focus on the serious work I needed to do with the Congress. First on the list was keeping up our relations with the opposition party. I got hold of the Republicans' new House Majority Leader to invite him to a breakfast at the Naval Observatory, where the
See?
Enter the race for the Democratic nomination, I assured her. I would be running for the nomination, not against her. I would run because I believed I was the best suited nominee for the moment. But if I ran, I told her, I would not run a negative campaign. She said the same. Although some of our supporters can get out of hand sometimes, she noted, it would not be me. Hillary told me she had thought long and hard about it, and she had decided to seek the nomination. I have so much respect for you and all that you've done, she said, and I just wanted to tell you personally. She told me she wasn't ready to announce right away, and she would appreciate it if I kept it quiet. Which I did. I told no one. As I walked her to the front door on her way out, I was pretty sure Hillary hadn't gotten all she had come for that morning. I think she had been hoping to hear me say I was standing down, that I wasn't going to seek the nomination. But I couldn't do that yet. I walked her to the door, gave her a warm embrace, and said goodbye. I felt a little twinge of sadness for Hillary as I watched her walk down the steps that morning. She was as determined as always and confident that she could do the job. She was also running well ahead of me and every other potential Democratic candidate in the very early polls. The sage political analysts would say she was probably on the way to a historic victory, the first woman to win the White House. But she did not evince much joy at the prospect of running. I may have misread her entirely that morning, but she seemed to me like a person propelled by forces not entirely of her own making. And I had absolutely no doubt she understood how brutal the campaign would be for her. What she was about to do took real courage. It felt like relief to be in the air the next morning, flying east over the Atlantic Ocean, into the rising sun, and headed for serious and consequential business. Added to that, I had my 16-year-old granddaughter, Finnegan Biden, with me for the entire trip. I had made sure the final stop in Europe, right down the road from my last official meeting, would really be just private time for Finnegan and me. The vice presidency had lived up to Joel's hopes of a new adventure for the entire family. One of the great privileges of the office was being able to take my older grandchildren around the world. It was an incredible educational experience for them, and not a burden for me or my staff. At least, One of them had been to every continent save Antarctica. I had watched my younger grandchildren, Natalie and Hunter, as they floated in the Dead Sea, met the King of Jordan, and visited the United Arab Emirates and the Persian Gulf. I got to meet the President and the Prime Minister of Finland, both of them women. On the plane ride to Moscow afterward, somebody on my staff turned to Finnegan and said, "Isn't it amazing meeting two women who run that country?" "You know what's more amazing?" Finnegan answered. "Almost half the members of the parliament are women." There were only a few places Finnegan was not allowed to go with me on that trip. She had to wait patiently in an anteroom at Vladimir Putin's private office in Moscow when I had my meeting with the Russian leader. Putin was biding his time as Russia's prime minister while his protege, Dmitry Medvedev, sat as a temporary placeholder in the presidency. President Obama had been working hard to strengthen our relationship with the Russian government. Administration had convinced Medvedev, which really meant Putin, to sign a major new treaty that called for an enormous bilateral reduction of nuclear weapons, but the relationship was already showing new strains. I was in Moscow to make the case that Russia had no reason to fear the recent redeployment of launchers for the missile defense shield in Europe, which was designed to intercept attacks from Iran. Putin was not happy that the launchers were to be repositioned in countries so near his border, like Poland and Romania, and kept asserting that the interceptors were aimed at Russian missiles. He had already sent Medvedev out to make threats about walking away from all the nuclear arms treaties, old and new, which would land the world back in a new Cold War. I was there to explain the planned changes to the system, to offer complete transparency in deployment and operation, and to assure Putin that it was not designed to nor would it interfere with Russia's own strategic defenses. I wasn't sure just what I was walking into. President George W. Bush famously said he had looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul. I wanted to see for myself. While I had been encouraged by Putin's willingness to sign on to the nuclear arms treaty, I thought the Russian leader had proven himself unworthy of
the briefing books and talking with my trusted foreign policy staff about what exactly we needed to accomplish on the trip. Air Force 2 would be touching down that evening in Brussels, where I had meetings scheduled with the highest-ranking leaders of the European Union and a one-on-one with the Prime Minister of Belgium the next day. But that was just warm-up for the critical business at the Munich Security Conference that weekend. The Security Conference was like coming full circle and facing a new reckoning with Vladimir Putin, who was once again president of the Russian Federation and acting badly. I had been to the Munich Security Conference in 2009, just 3 weeks after we took office, to make a speech laying out President Obama's major goals in foreign policy to a world audience. Part of that speech was meant for Putin. The Russian leader needed to hear the president's commitment to European security, as well as his desire to have Russia as a partner in that effort. Our new administration supported the further strengthening of European defense, an increased role for the European Union in preserving peace and security, a fundamentally stronger NATO-EU partnership, and a deeper cooperation with countries outside the alliance who share our common goals and principles. I said. The United States rejects the notion that NATO's gain is Russia's loss, or that Russia's strength is NATO's weakness. It is time to paraphrase President Obama. It's time to press the reset button and revisit the many areas where we can and should be working together with Russia. The United States and Russia can disagree and still work together where our interests coincide. And they coincide in many places. I made the president's position crystal clear. We were open to cooperation, but there were basic ground rules. We will not recognize any nation having a sphere of influence, I assured the conference, and everybody in that room understood I meant that the United States and its NATO allies would not permit Russia to force former Soviet republics back into its orbit against their will. It will remain our view that sovereign states have the right to make their own decisions and choose their own alliances. Our administration was seeking to promote and extend the liberal international order that had been in place for 40 years, a Europe free, whole, and at peace, with each and every independent country having agreed upon and secure borders. By February 2015, as I headed toward Munich, Vladimir Putin had signaled that he was no longer happy playing by the rules Soviet leaders had accepted as part of the historic and far-reaching Helsinki Accords in 1975. He was willing to test European resolve on the principle of the sanctity of borders, and he was doing so with impunity in Ukraine. My main objective in Munich was to continue to encourage our European allies to stand with us, to make sure Putin understood that Russia would pay a price for bullying a weaker neighbor. The Ukrainian people had been on a thrilling and sometimes harrowing roller coaster for the previous year, and I felt like I had been on it with them. A popular demonstration, which started at a square in Kiev in late 2013, when President Viktor Yanukovych reneged on his promise to take the country into the European Union, had grown from a spontaneous eruption to a real political movement one President Yanukovych mishandled badly. I had known and worked with Yanukovych since 2009, and I knew he was in a tough spot. While popular pressure mounted on Yanukovych to honor his EU pledge, Putin was obviously tightening the screws on him to resist the movement and tie the country more closely to Russia. Yanukovych did not handle the situation well. He resisted the democratic revolution of dignity in Maidan Nezalezhnosti with increasing force, eventually loosing his riot police on the streets of Kiev to disrupt, injure, and finally murder demonstrators. The protesters in the Maidan found themselves in a war zone, enduring a brutal 3-month siege in the dead of winter. They refused to back down, even in the face of death, and transformed the square where the protest began into an armed camp. Demonstrators seized administration buildings and erected barricades so they could set up command centers, mess halls, and aid stations for people beaten and bloodied by Yanukovych's uniformed police and his secret plainclothes thugs. The crowds of protesters grew to more than 50,000 and just kept growing. By the middle of February 2014, they were inching toward the parliament building. I made the last of many urgent calls to Yanukovych in late February of 2014, when his saying Ukraine was bound Europe Britain. International law is being violated. But she was not strong enough for my
taste. The passive voice weakened her statement. And I was disappointed when, after her speech, she flatly refused to consider providing any real weaponry to Ukraine's overmatched military. The progress that Ukraine needs cannot be Achieved by more weapons, she said. She seemed to have the sympathy of the crowd on that point. I left the Merkel event and told my staff we had to revise my own remarks. My words needed to be as direct and declarative as possible. We had less than 4 hours to fix the speech, and I had to do the meeting with Merkel and Poroshenko first. I instructed my team to start unlawyering the language of the speech. I wanted them to make absolutely sure that the plain meaning could not be missed, and told them I would be back to help with rewrites as soon as I could. The room for the meeting with President Poroshenko and Chancellor Merkel was nothing fancy. We sat at a relatively small table in the corner of a conference room, which meant it was an intimate talk. Poroshenko seemed relieved I was there. He knew I was committed to Ukraine's success for its own sake and also as a proof to Russia of European resolve. I thought the outcome of the Ukraine crisis would set the tone for Central and Eastern Europe for decades. For good or for ill. I had been hard on Poroshenko since his election 9 months earlier. I'd made it clear to him that he could not afford to give the Europeans any excuse for walking away from the sanctions regime against Russia. He had to continue to fight the elements of corruption that were embedded in the political culture of Ukraine's Soviet and post-Soviet governance, both in Yatsenyuk's rival party and in Poroshenko's own. But the Ukrainian president also knew I had gone to bat for him to get aid packages from the International Monetary Fund and loan guarantees from the United States. That I had been pushing hard at the Principals Committee meetings to provide training for his military, and had already been able to get him non-lethal equipment like the special radars Ukraine's military needed to identify the location of Russian mortars. Poroshenko could not have missed my own sense of urgency where the future of Ukraine was concerned. Poroshenko knew he was in a much stronger position with Merkel as well. Her relationship with Putin had soured over his actions in Ukraine in recent months. Putin was the bad actor here, the Chancellor assured Poroshenko at a meeting that day, but she nonetheless pressed him, as she had us, to construct some sort of off-ramp for Putin. She was looking for concessions from the Ukrainian president she could take to Putin the next day. She believed the Russian leader needed to be able to walk away and claim some victory. She out of Ukraine or face continued isolation and growing economic costs at home. What was 15 minutes in the grand scheme? What was 20 minutes? 25? Ladies and gentlemen, as the chairman said earlier today, I did stand here 6 years ago and in the first major foreign policy address of our administration, I spoke about the reset. I began 32 minutes behind schedule. The speech only ran 28 minutes. I was declarative and I was direct. America and Europe are being tested, I said. President Putin has to understand that, as he has changed, so has our focus. We have moved from resetting this important relationship to reasserting the fundamental bedrock principles on which European freedom and stability rest. And I'll say it again. Inviolate borders, no spheres of influence, the sovereign right to choose your own alliances. I cannot repeat that often enough. We need to remain resolute and united in our support of Ukraine, as the Chancellor said this morning. What happens there will resonate well beyond Ukraine. It matters to all, not just in Europe, but around the world, all who may be subject to aggression. I came as close as I could to telling our NATO allies that it was our moral duty to provide weapons to Ukraine. The Ukrainians had shown real courage, and though they were unlikely to stop any determined Russian military aggression, I believe they deserved to be able to try to defend themselves. 2. Many times President Putin has promised peace, and delivered tanks, troops, and weapons. So we will continue to provide Ukraine with security assistance, not to encourage war but to allow Ukraine to defend itself. Let me be clear, we do not believe there is a military solution in Ukraine. But let me be equally clear, we do not believe Russia has the right to do what they're doing. We believe we should attempt an honorable peace. But we also believe the Ukrainian people have a right to defend themselves. I pause.
We're finally behind
Me, but not my duty as Pop. And I did not take my job as grandfather any less seriously than I did my job as vice president. The last stop in Germany was a guided tour for Finnegan and me of the World War II era concentration camp at Dachau, a field trip that had become another Biden family tradition. This was a place I felt all my children and grandchildren needed to experience. I had taken Bo and Hunter and Ashley on separate trips to Dachau when they were teenagers, and Finnegan was now of age, too. My insistence on taking my children and grandchildren to see Dachau had to do with my own father, who used to talk about the horrors of the Holocaust at the dinner table when I was a kid. The discussions were never long, and he didn't preach at us or make any big speeches about Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews in Germany, but he imparted real wisdom. Dad would remind us that a campaign of that size could not have been waged in secret. The idea that the German people did not know this was happening defied logic. Humans were capable of incredible cruelty. Our father wanted me, my sister, and my brothers to understand. And just as dangerous, he made us see, human beings were also capable of looking the other way and remaining silent when awful things were happening all around them. The man in the wheelchair, Max Mannheimer, had been a prisoner at Dachau and other concentration camps when he was a young man. He and one brother had survived, but his wife, his parents, his sisters, and another brother had all been murdered. I wanted Finnegan to hear his personal story. I had also given her some reading material in preparation for the trip. Dachau was the first concentration camp put into operation by the Nazis in 1933. The first prisoners there were Hitler's political opponents, German communists, Social Democrats, and trade unionists. Then came Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals, and other people the Nazis deemed undesirable. In the late 1930s, the Nazis began to fill the camp with Jews. Almost 30,000 prisoners were worked to death or murdered at Dachau between 1940 and 1945. Nobody can say for sure how many were killed at Dachau in the years before. Then, I assigned Finnegan an essay that included the following poem by Martin Niemöller, a Protestant pastor who was thrown into a German concentration camp at the end of the war. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. Finnegan and I were escorted through the camp by a tour guide in Mr. Mannheimer. It was the same path I had taken with Finnegan's father, Hunter, 30 years earlier, but it was different. It seemed as though things had been rearranged to make visitors less uncomfortable. They had softened the cruel edges over the years, as I should have expected from a line in the Dachau site literature. As every season has its own charm in Germany, it read, you can also plan to visit the camp according to your own preference. The bunks in the living quarters at Dachau were still there, so you could see how the Nazis packed tens of thousands of people into the camp. I remembered seeing names carved into the wooden frames of the bunks on earlier visits, but now the bunks appeared clean and varnished. At first the guide seemed reluctant to take Finnegan and me to the camp's notorious gas chamber, but I insisted. I was thinking of the first time I went there, with Bo, how we walked into that building and they explained to us that the prison guards would tell their victims that they were going to the showers and instruct them to remove their shoes, their clothes, and their false teeth. Then, the guides led us into the chamber itself and slammed the door behind us with a frightening clank. There are guides at Dachau today who insist the prisoners were never gassed there, or that it was used only a handful of times. But I wanted Finnegan to see all of that, and I wanted her to see the ovens where the guards cremated the victims after they were shot, hanged, starved to death, killed as part of medical experiments, or actually gassed. Max Mannheimer was a living witness. He had been forced to load into wagons the corpses of victims who had died at nearby work camps, then haul them to the ovens at Dachau to be cremated. Finnegan saw and heard it all, and then we walked back outside.